Well, I think the everyday American is facing a triple crunch when it comes to energy. First, there's been a real price squeeze. There's hardly an American who hasn't felt gas pains as they get to the pump and have to fill up. And I think that's really putting a pinch on a lot of people. And it is changing behavior. People are starting to look for ways to conserve energy. They're looking at smaller cars. Detroit is having to downshift quickly to more fuel-efficient vehicles. But I think there's a second dimension to this that people are quite distressed about, and it's the dependence on fossil fuels, and particularly on fossil fuels from international sources that are often unreliable. I think the American public's gotten very frustrated with the situation in Iraq, very concerned about dependence on fossil fuels from the Middle East. And frankly, even if we were able to get ourselves out of the Middle East, the next series of oil suppliers, Russia, Kazakhstan, Nigeria, Venezuela, are no better. So I think there's a lot of people worried about dependence on these very unstable places for the lifeblood of our economy. And then the third issue, all rolled into one, is concern about the environment. I think people are very worried about the fossil fuel implications when it comes to both local pollution, air pollution in our cities, and the rising rates of asthma, and then of course climate change. I think there's a real recognition now that the longer we stay dependent on fossil fuels, the harder it's going to be to really address the problems of the buildup of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Well, I think we're moving towards a real commitment in the United States to address greenhouse gases, and I think that's likely to involve some kind of a price signal. So I think we're going to have both the everyday citizen needing to re-gear their behavior to address a carbon-constrained life, and frankly, the business world is stepping up in a very big way, seeing in the first instance a real opportunity to save money by reducing their energy spending. And frankly, a surprising number of companies now see an upside opportunity here as society gets serious about reducing greenhouse gas emissions and reducing energy consumption. A good number of companies see a chance to sell goods and services that help their customers do that. That's really a sideshow. Frankly, the thought that we're somehow going to get out of our current energy crunch by more drilling is playing a game we can't win. We are in possession of 3% of the world's oil reserves. If we try to pursue a drill strategy as our way forward, we're going to be dependent forever on overseas sources for the vast majority of our oil. What we really need is a new energy strategy that moves us off fossil fuels onto alternative energy, and at the same time commits us to a much greater effort at energy efficiency and conservation. Well, I think the truth is, as long as we're dependent on overseas oil, we're not in control of our own fate. And that's really what's fundamentally unacceptable over time. And we have an alternative, and it's really to focus on innovation, to drive our economy towards a new energy future, and to do much more with innovation and technology development. And frankly, what Saudi Arabia is to oil, America is to innovation. This is playing to our strong suit. It's a game we can win and can do well with. Well, you've got big companies and small that are stepping up to try and make a difference in this regard. So you've got lots of entrepreneurial activities, small startup businesses trying out the widest imaginable array of alternative energy sources, from geothermal power to wind power, solar power, then people trying to do quite exotic things like extract fuel from algae. And at the same time, some of our big, long-standing companies have stepped up and decided they can become environmental goods and services providers. So you have General Electric under CEO Jeff Immelt that has really emerged as a major player in a variety of clean tech enterprises. So they've got a big commitment to high-efficiency locomotives, high-efficiency jet engines. They've got a wind power business, a solar power business, a clean water technology business. So this is an amazing turnaround for GE. And of course, it's not because Jeff Immelt thinks he's doing good. He knows he's doing well for the future of GE by investing in high growth and high margin businesses. Well, the truth is that there's a lot of companies stepping up on the promise of a different future than the past. But to really lock that in and to create the incentives for deep investment and real commitment over time, we have to have a framework of regulations that provide a signal to the private sector that investments here will pay off. So we need to have a commitment to greenhouse gas emissions controls. We need a cap and trade system, or alternatively some combination, more likely some combination of incentives that involve charging people for the harm they cause, making people pay for their greenhouse gas emissions, and then a variety of other things, including green building standards, commitment to better appliance efficiency, all of which will help spur innovation. Well, frankly, we have seeded the innovation opportunity over the last 8 years in a very major way. The U.S. has historically been a leader on environment issues, historically been a leader on clean energy, but if you don't have a regulatory framework that supports private sector investment, that really rewards innovation, you can fall behind, and we have. So we're going to have to renew our leadership role, and frankly, beyond that, it's not just about America, it's got to be a global commitment. This is a global challenge. We need companies all over the world, in the United States, in Europe, frankly across Africa, across Latin America, and particularly in Asia, where China and India are major contributors to the problem and need to also see themselves as part of the solution. Well, I think the public really wants a clean energy future. The public wants to get off of dependence on foreign oil. The public wants to respond to the problem of climate change. And frankly, the business world is stepping up. I think that's what's very interesting to see, that sea change in attitudes as companies have come to realize the environment in general, climate change in particular, is not just about regulations to follow and burdens to bear, but has this upside opportunity for companies that can provide solutions. Sadly, Washington seems to be lagging, both the public and the business world. And a real challenge going forward for the new administration is whether we can get the kind of bipartisan, cross-the-aisle support for an appropriate regulatory strategy that will restore the U.S. to a leadership position and help set the world up for a successful response to climate change. I think it's going to be very difficult, but I guess I'm pessimistic in the very short term, but more optimistic over a middle to longer term. There's a difficult dual stage exercise that we have to go through of bringing together consensus within our domestic political scene, bridging some very deep divides, really getting Republicans and Democrats to work together, getting the East and the West and the center and the South and the North all to come together on a strategy that works for everyone, and at the same time finding a way to engage the world. A world that's very suspicious about the U.S. on this issue because of the lack of leadership, frankly, the foot dragging over the past number of years. So it's a big challenge, and I think it's going to require tremendous leadership from the new administration. So the critical way forward involves re-engaging the world and really reasserting the principle that has been at the center of every successful global environmental effort, and that's the principle of common but differentiated responsibility. Common meaning every country steps up to obligations, and it was a huge mistake in Kyoto not to ask everyone to do something. Differentiated meaning, of course, that countries are going to have different levels of obligation. The U.S. and Europe are going to have to bring down their emissions from current levels. They're going to have to reduce dramatically from where they are today. China and India will have to reduce the trajectory of growth in their emissions. Instead of growing emissions perhaps 60% in China over the next decade, they're going to have to bring that down to 30% or 20%. So everyone has a role to play, and it's critical that we have U.S. leadership to get the whole world behind a common response to this global challenge. I think it's almost certain we're going to need a portfolio response to climate change. So we're going to need some kind of a price signal, either a harm charge on carbon emissions or a cap and trade system. The more likely logic seems right now around cap and trade. We've got experience with that in our Clean Air Act of 1990, where a cap and trade system helped us take down enormously the sulfur dioxide emissions that were creating acid rain. But we're going to need beyond that charges for people who are causing greenhouse gas emissions. And frankly, beyond that, we're going to need some old-style command and control mandates to move action ahead in things like appliance standards and green building standards. So it's going to be a sweep of incentives across the board, and really perhaps beyond that, some tax credits and some other things that will engage the private sector in the search for solutions, that will motivate the entrepreneurs, the venture capitalists, the innovators, the creative spirits across our country in finding ways to reduce emissions. I think there's almost no doubt that energy and the related environment and economic issues are going to be at the very heart of the new president's challenge. And it's been a difficult period in terms of the economic stability of our country and of our world. But with the economic situation getting stabilized as a first priority, a top-tier second priority is going to be this interrelated connection of energy, environment, and national security concerns that's largely centered on our addiction to fossil fuels, and will really have to focus on getting us off fossil fuels and onto a clean energy future, as well as a commitment to much greater conservation and energy efficiency. So there's two different ways that economic stress that we're all under plays out in the energy and environment arena. On the one hand, there's a distraction because the economic issues are so severe, so very difficult, really threatening the fundamentals of our economy in a way we haven't seen threatened in 80 years since the Great Depression. So that's a big deal, and we can't ignore it, and it is going to mean a priority on getting the economics right. On the other hand, I think there's been some games being played on Wall Street in terms of how investments get done and people taking risks with other people's money. And I think a world of transparency, a world where we return to the fundamentals of sound investing, which is the promise of a future payoff, could drive money into this clean tech world that I've spoken about as key to our energy future. And I think there's a lot of people who see a big promise here. Energy is a $6 trillion a year business globally. Over the next couple of decades, somewhere between 10 and 40 years, we're going to totally remake that energy world. That's a big set of opportunities for companies that get good ideas and can push them forward. Again, there's several issues there. On the one hand, there's some promise of potential fossil fuels beneath the Arctic and a growing battle over sovereignty of the Arctic in terms of people positioning themselves to make claims on those resources. The other thing that's a very big deal is the possibility we're going to see the Arctic Sea melt, which opens up a new sea route for shipping. And there could be some really interesting debates over who can and when people can use that route over the top of Canada or over the top of Russia as an alternative to going through the Panama Canal or across the bottom of South America. So some dramatic strategic issues for both countries and companies as basic assumptions about how the world works change in the future.